So this is where we left off in the last lecture. I had started this slide but quickly retracted about decentering knowledge, and I then decided that maybe we'll work it around in a different way, come to that slide slightly differently. Just to recap, I want to reiterate this idea of the knowledge power grid. The idea that the act of producing knowledge is also an act of power. The only way you can produce knowledge is to exercise power. And every act of exercising power also produces knowledge. So this was crucial, right? We have seen the whole movement, intellectual movement, till we reach this point, right, of the knowledge power grid. That there is no possibility of producing knowledge which is objective, which is neutral. Now go back to the ideas that we started off this course with, the ideas of an objective fact. The historian needing to be neutral. The historian needing to be somebody who distances himself or later herself from the facts, from the narrative of history, and looking at it with disinterest. What we have come to now in this understanding of the world is that the production of knowledge is at the same time an exercise of power, and every exercise of power also produces knowledge of its own. It's not as if you can exercise power without knowledge. There is no possibility of acting in the world without knowledge. And there is no way of gaining knowledge unless you exercise power. Before we continue with this, I want to get two terms introduced to you which are really important to understand the way in which the discipline of history and the methods of history got changed with these ideas. The two terms are discourse and narrative. And the way I will discuss them in class today, the way we will discuss this in class today is going to be very specific to the manner in which post-structuralists discuss discourse and narrative, the way they define it. Because both discourse and narrative, like a lot of other words we have seen till now, have a much older precedent. I mean, they have been used for centuries before this. But it was in the second half of the 20th century, post-Second World War primarily, that a new meaning to discourse and to narrative came across. Oops, sorry. So what about discourse? Discourse says that if the world is structured like a language and it can be known only through language, there is no reality outside of language, outside of the structure, the system of signs, meaning carrying signs that we create, and that the world, the structure of the world we see is something which is derived from the structure of language. If both these things are true, then actually the world is a text. We need to read the world as a text, a discourse. And a discourse here is not what Sri Sri Ravi Shankar or the Pope or any lecturer like this gives. Discourse, here it is defined as something which is self-contained. All the reference, all the things that the different signs referred to are contained within that discourse. So you do not go outside the discourse to understand what the signs mean. It is meaning giving. So how do we, because it is arbitrary, how do we understand the meaning? Because it is within a discourse and we are part of this discourse, so everything is within that, and this makes it coherent. So what I am telling you is coherent to you because I am part of this discourse. This bounded body, a boundary that defines what can be said or what can be read. The fact that I am saying something or I am doing something, my action can be read not just at the same time but even after 100 years, 1,000 years, is because it is placed inside something which is self-contained, which gives meanings. All the signs within that refer to each other, and each sign gives meaning to the other sign. Of course, these are arbitrary meanings as we had seen earlier, but these signs are contained within this bounded structure. That is a discourse. And you, as an author, will read it, the assumption being that if we share that discourse, then what I tell you is comprehensible to you, has meaning to you, because we share that same discourse. We understand the universe of meanings contained within that. But it is important here to remember that the discourse is always partial. The discourse has a boundary. There's things beyond that which that discourse cannot explain. So the same word in one discourse means something and in another discourse means completely different things. So in a discourse, for example, which say, how do people use the term discourse? Say the discourse of patriarchy. Love means something completely different than within the discourse of feminism. To take an example from one of the historians we are going to talk about, and an example we are going to talk about later, prison, imprisoning, prison means a very different thing within the discourse of modernity than earlier discourses. The word discipline, which we'll again come to, means very different things. The word justice. And as we had discussed earlier in class, when we are looking at time and space, for example, the question of time, the question, so to use a word like slow makes sense to you. When I say slow, it will make sense only if we share the same discursive field. What is a discursive field? It is the bounded area of a discourse. So we share the same discursive field. We share the same set of meanings, the same relationship of those meanings. It is internally coherent, that discourse. That discursive field lays out certain possibilities. So if that discursive field is a football field and there's a ball there, we know what to do with it. Instinctively, I don't need to tell you. I do something and you know exactly what I'm doing. Whereas if that discursive field is shaped like a basketball field, the same ball and the same set of people, their actions have a different meaning. So that discursive field is set, right? It is bounded. And based on this is the idea of a narrative. The narrative is basically a coherent story which is constructed by the author. It is something which is not there, given. So if I say the history of food, or the history of climate change, or the history of transportation, or the history of, I don't know, the freedom struggle in India. These are all narratives that the author creates using the idea of a discourse. So these narratives are created within a discursive field. So I can create a narrative of the freedom of the Indian nation. I can create a narrative of the slow growth and spread of civilization. I can create a narrative of how liberty or equality spread in the world. I can create a narrative of how over the last 10,000 years things have progressively become worse. This is a narrative I create within a discursive field. It's a narrative that is created by the author. The author owns it. And the function of a narrative is that the narrative tries to convince you to buy into it. And if you buy into it, if a sufficiently large number of people buy into it within that discursive field, it in a sense becomes a meta-narrative. The meta-narrative of civilization. That there is something which is happening which is civilizing human beings. That when we go back into the past, we look at it and it tells us the story of civilization. It's a narrative which is created and becomes a meta-narrative because a sufficiently large number of people have bought into it, and it is, in a sense, become a consensus within a certain discursive field. So the story of civilization, for example, the narrative of civilizing, of the growth of civilization, is one which works within the discursive field of, say, rationality. Within the discursive field which says liberty and equality are founding principles of human beings, or founding qualities of human beings. If you think that is not true, then there is no meta-narrative of civilizing, or of civilization. So this narrative is created, right? And we'll see why these are really important for us when we, yep.
Like you said, the civilization can be looked as a narrative inside the discursive field of rationality.
Right.
So who is the author there?
So there is no individual who's an author, right? So often these structures are created by a set of people. Sometimes you can say there were one or two people who were crucial to building this. So this whole thing of the idea of progress, or the idea of civilization. So the post-structuralists would say that it was something which was authored by Enlightenment rationality, by Rousseau, by Kant, before that by Descartes. Locke was a very important part of it. Hegel and Marx played very important later roles. In fact, if you use a cricket analogy, Marx was the night watchman who saw the innings through across the day without a fall of wicket. So it's not that the author, which is why the author is in italics. It's not an individual, right? These are narratives which are created by often many people, ways of thought. So we all end up creating these. These are structures which are not created by one person. This is not God-given. These are structures which come up through human actions, but irrespective of human actions. We are not consciously creating them. Through our relations, interactions, we build up a structure. So from here, I'd now get back to the slide, which has changed slightly, right? The whole idea of decentering knowledge. Now, what the post-structuralism, the post-structuralists, in a sense, and as I keep telling you, a lot of what people today call post-structuralists, post-modernists, they themselves never claimed that they were post-structuralists or post-modernists. They just said, we are engaging with ideas, we are engaging with what is coming. It is only others from outside who have actually, in a sense, and we'll come to that concept, epistemic violence, they have sort of imposed these categories on them. But a lot of people who accepted the insights of structuralism said one of the problems with the idea of structure that Saussure gives, that Lévi-Strauss gives, then they go back and see people like Marx as structuralists who gave this whole idea of capitalism as a structure. That doesn't matter whether you are a good-hearted person or a bad-hearted person. It doesn't matter what you are, but if you are the owner of capital, there are certain ways in which you will work. Capital works irrespective of human agency. Classes, working class, the middle class, what he called the petty bourgeoisie, works irrespective of what individual people want. They said, the people we now call post-structuralists, and I'll repeat those names a little later, they said the thing with structuralism is that despite its radical analysis, despite its anti-humanist advances, and when I say anti-humanist, they are not cruel people, right? Humanist as in human beings is not the center. The structure becomes the focus now. Structure is where real knowledge lies. Structure is what we need to study. Agency can only happen, human actions can only happen when you understand the structure. Otherwise, human actions are meaningless. They said the problem with structuralism, as it had happened with Saussure or Lévi-Strauss, Marx, is that it had worked with the assumption that the structure is anchored. The structure is anchored, right? There is a center which gives meaning to the whole structure. So finally you sort of boil it down and there is this thing which gives meaning to it. So depending on how you interpret, say, Marx, you could say the center, the anchor is capital, or you could say the anchor is dialectics. Or if you wanted to give a more historical term to dialectics, you could say the anchor is class struggle. That's the center. They started saying that that actually is an a priori assumption. It's something external which is put into the structure. This center, this anchor that is given to the structure is something which is not there. Why should any one thing be the center of that structure? Why should it anchor the structure? Why should it be the hub around which the structure is built? It's an alien thing within that, and it basically clouds our thinking about that structure. So the argument was that we need to decenter the structure. Think of a structure which doesn't have a center. And once you do that, then actually structuralism, without letting go of its main arguments, you can actually have a situation where structuralism allows you to think of innumerable. Innumerable means you can't count, right? Beyond counting. Innumerable possibilities. So human beings can do hundreds of things. Structure allows you to play. The signifier, signified, the meanings, everything gets decentered. There is not one thing which holds it. Why do you need something to hold the structure? You can actually think of a structure not as a crystal, but as a rhizome spreading through the ground. You know what a rhizome is? Ginger, potato. Soon enough, you don't know what is the center. They just spread. It goes wherever. You never can predict where it will go. It will break off, start again. In the same pattern, sometimes in a different pattern. The ability of the play, right? There is actually, if you look at it, structuralism now allows you, if you let go of this obsession with anchoring it into something, into humans, into reason, on something or the other, then it basically allows you an infinite number of possibilities. Structure doesn't become a constraint. So then you can actually go back and think of human action within structure, but able to do anything. There is actually no original and no copy. Nothing comes prior and nothing comes after that. The hierarchy of the binary, right, goes. So you only have signifiers. The signified itself is a signifier, unendingly. And what does this mean? There is no concept of the original. The world is simulacra. You know what is simulacra? Check the meaning of the word. What does simulacra mean? The world is simulacra. There is no original. The idea of an original immediately brings an artificial anchor, a center to the structure. Makes you think of structure like a crystal, which invariably will be the same. Whereas it can be like this, all over the place. It's still binary, it's still a structure, it still takes precedence. It's primary over agency, but it then allows you to have innumerable possibilities of play. Basically, what this argument says is that once you let go of this center, of this idea that every structure has a center which organizes it, an organizing principle, if that is not there, then what had come through a different route to this whole knowledge power grid and the question of arbitrary meaning, it then says, actually, if you look at the world as structures which are in a state of play, which are decentered, then meanings are constructed into texts all the time in different ways. There is no given meaning. And what you can do is take out layer beyond layer of meanings that have been put into actions. So what am I telling you here? The way I'm walking, what I'm doing, how you're receiving it, how we behave in class, what we do, everything. There are these layers and layers and layers which we can take out. There is no center which we finally reach. Now, I want to move a little from there into the idea of what is postmodernism. Postmodernism is similar to post-structuralism. It draws on all the ideas that we have been discussing, but its aims and objectives, how it functions, is slightly different. What postmodernism says is that the claims of modern, we are modern, right? Modernity are not self-evident. That the pre-modern, that there is no move from pre-modern to modern. That's a narrative which has been built within a discursive field. And they're questioning that. What does modern mean? What does it mean to say this is modern and that's traditional or that's pre-modern? What does it mean? Anybody has any idea? What would you say is a modern?
Generally is associated with culture, like some progress, or like the ideas become progressive, something of that sort.
Yeah. The inevitability of progress. The idea that reason can actually help us understand everything. And not just understand, explain. That human agency, that human beings are capable of finally breaching every boundary that comes up. So of course you reach a boundary with the present level of understanding, abilities to deal with the world. You reach a boundary and then you go beyond. So we have seen this, right? Humanism, the belief in human agency. So modern tells you that human agency finally can actually inevitably break every limit that there is. We can't do it now, but maybe in the future. That the whole world, our existence, is basically the actualizing of science fiction. Human agency, right? And how do we do that? Because human beings have reason. We are rational beings. Everything can be addressed through the application of reason, the practice of reason. Everything. So maybe a generation can't do it. Maybe 10 people can't do it. Maybe an individual can't do it. Maybe 10 generations can't do it. But eventually, it will. It's only a matter of time. And matter of time is the inevitability of progress. So, if you remember, in other classes, and even in this class earlier, I think, I had talked about the idea, the two visions of history. Do you remember this from an earlier class? So if we plot history over time, and this is sort of, let's say, 100,000 BC, and this is the present, and this is a point which we can say is and this is a point which is right. The traditional way in which history was looked at was a story of the fall. It was a story of the fall. That human beings were created perfect or near about perfect. And history is about them reaching terrible conditions. And there are various ways. So this could be the end, or this could be just the beginning of another cycle which starts here and goes back. It's a very modern claim to say that human beings began somewhere here, and history actually has been whatever, but a story of growth. So there have been falls in between. We have gone down. But inevitably, we have gone up. Through what? The application of reason. So, of course, reason at this point is not the same as reason applied here. That has also changed because of progress. But it has constantly gone up. And you have had dark ages when from a high you have come down to a low. But inevitably, humans have the capacity to move up through what? Human agency, their ability to do things, their ability to deal with the world by the application of reason. This is how we see the world today. That our ancestors were cave-dwelling primitive beings who could barely do things which we take now completely for granted, whether in the material world or in the what was called spiritual, today is called intellectual world, right? Concepts, ideas, far more nuanced, far richer today. Clothes, food, shelter, basic ideas of how human beings should live, how family should function, how society should function, how state should function. All of these have seen progress. That is not to say there have not been falls, but overall progress. That's the story that modernism claims. Postmodernists, the postmodern argument questions all of this. It critiques all these claims. It draws on structuralism to say that human agency actually in itself explains very little. Reason is just a discursive field. There are other discursive fields. Revelation. You know what is revelation? It's almost the binary opposite of reason. So God comes and reveals yourself. And Moses comes down with chiseled stones telling us what to do forever. God reveals himself in a cave, and Muhammad comes out and tells people what to do forever. There's a battle going to start, but God takes time out and tells you what to do forever in the Gita, or whatever else. Revelation. There's no application of reason. So of course you can have reason there with a small r. You can reason it out. What does the Gita say? What does it mean? How do I apply this? Of course. But revelation. And revelation doesn't necessarily have to be, it doesn't have to be religious. It can be a moment when you don't know why certain things click in your brain, certain things happen. Poetry. literature, a painting, a play, a film. What is it about Sholay that makes it, or Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, DDLJ, what makes it a classic, which other films haven't done? How do you explain it rationally? You can explain it by saying, oh, this market happened, that actor was popular, but that is not a full explanation, right? So, they say reason, of course, is important, but not with a capital R. There is no universal reason which can explain everything, from the laws of physics to why families break up, from how chemistry works to how which ice cream flavor is popular where. There is no one universal reason. There are various discursive fields. And rationality with a capital R is actually a discursive field which helps you build this meta-narrative of progress. You stand here, right? You stand here and you look back and this is what you see. And you say, this is it. The human looks back and says, this is it. You're imposing an anchor to that structure. It's not there. Postmodernism is a political position. It emerged in the 20th century, drawing on the intellectual resources of structuralism, post-structuralism, and other what in the 19th century used to be called romantic ideas, right? Basically to critique power and domination. Postmodernism was a reaction to the excesses of industrial society, to the excesses of the application of reason. This is not to say that their intellectual arguments were perforce less powerful or correct, but within the postmodernist world, actually the whole claim of being correct doesn't really make sense. Because there is no primacy of reason. To say this is correct and that is not correct, overall, universally, like for everybody, for all times to come, across time and space, to say this is correct and that is not correct, assumes a universal reason. Postmodernists say there actually isn't. There is no reason why industrial society is better than non-industrial society. There is no reason why a certain form of looking at the world is better than any others. The meanings it creates, the justifications it creates, the rewards it gives, the punishments it gives, are all within that discursive field. And as long as we are part of that discursive field, we accept it. We then engage with those narratives. But what it says is, modernism, the modern, the idea of modernity, is itself a narrative like this, within the discursive field of Enlightenment rationality, which claims that all humans have rights, all humans are free, all humans are equal, which claims that these are basic attributes of humans across time and space, irrespective of anything else. I guess that's not true. This is something of a society we have created for ourselves through the working of the knowledge power grid. And this knowledge power grid is what has created our world. And all this dystopia, right? Big cities, polluted, people alienated, huge riches with huge poverty, pollution, the atom bomb, the perfection of killing. After all, the concentration camps were run in extremely rational ways. This was a romantic. So when I say romantic, I put it under quotes just to alert you to the fact that it doesn't mean romantic in the sense that a commonsensical drawing room sense, but romantic was an intellectual literary moment in the late 18th, early 19th century basically, Europe, where there was a reaction against the first industrialization that happened. People wanted to go back to their pastoral idyll, rural life. So you have poets like Wordsworth and Shelley and Byron. You have authors like, well, maybe everyone will not agree that the term romantic, but people like Tolstoy, for example. This critique of industrial society and all that it does, its claims of being far superior, and not superior only because, so what does industrial society say? It doesn't say we are superior only because we have better arms and better material goods. Of course it does, and it sort of pulls everyone down in front of it by those. But it says our superiority is the superiority of reason. The fact that we are agents of progress, and progress is inevitable. One day or the other you are going to be progressed, whether you like it or not. So it's better you learn to progress yourself. That is what modernity claims for itself. So there's this whole reaction of the romantics that we don't want this, we want to escape. In a sense, postmodernism was a political move drawing on the intellectual ideas of these people, of post-structuralism. And in this, right, I'll just continue speaking a little in detail about this. Drawing on the idea of the knowledge power grid, they foregrounded what Nietzsche had said. There was this 19th century philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, so drew on his idea of will to power. So Nietzsche said, to put it in a bit of a sort of cliche, he said humans are defined by the will to power. The will to power makes us human. And those who don't sort of develop their will to power don't fully become human. Now, this was, once you had this idea of the knowledge power grid, right, Enlightenment rationality, all these ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, science, rationality, all of these things were seen through the knowledge power grid as a will to power. A will to power of whom? Depends now, because these people had come through the whole process of, in a sense, deconstructing. So it could be the will to power of the capitalists. It could be the will to power of the Europeans. It could be the will to power of the whites. It could be the will to power of the males. It could be the will to power of the Protestants. Depends on how you then put meaning into this. So they said reason is universal. That's what modernity says. Enlightenment rationality says reason is universal. Because reason is universal, all human beings have fundamental rights. If reason wasn't universal, every human being will not have fundamental rights. What is the basis to say all human beings are equal, all human beings are free? That reason, rationality, is universal. Even if you leave the solar system and our galaxy, these will remain. The postmodernists, drawing on the intellectual resources that structuralism and post-structuralism had given them, said that is not true. Reason, the way it was defined by Enlightenment rationality, had a lot of great things about it, but it was basically something which was contextual. Rationality has to be contextual. It is within that structure. It has no meaning outside that structure, outside that discursive field. What is that structure? That discursive field, right? That discourse that was created. The discourse of rationality. Outside of that, this has no meaning. So those who have lived outside of the discursive field of Enlightenment rationality, for them, liberty and equality has no meaning. So I'll give you an example. You would look back and say, that how come there were all these women who were willingly accepting things which we today find intolerable? How come there were all these bonded laborers or slaves who were willingly accepting a lot of things we find intolerable? The only reason was because we think it is incomprehensible to us, because we think reason is universal. All human beings are free, all human beings are equal. So why is somebody not behaving in that way? So then you think that those people don't know enough, there's not been enough progress. But the postmodernists would argue that that's not true. They just have a different discursive field within which what you are saying doesn't have any sense, makes no sense. We go back to the Coca-Cola bottle in Gods Must Be Crazy. So think of equality as a Coca-Cola bottle which has been suddenly introduced among the Bushmen of the Kalahari. They don't know what it is. They're not going to use it. And they're going to use it in ways which you have no clue whatsoever what it is to be done. The same, right? That reason is not, rationality is not the foundation of knowledge. There are other ways of knowing the world which have served human beings very well for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the claim that Enlightenment rationality can explain all that exists says, the postmodernists would argue that reason flattens all the uniqueness and particularity in the world. It is incapable of explaining everything. So the argument then comes is what we think is the age of reason is actually the age of power. Rationality is actually just the ideas of a particular set of people at a particular historical moment. What we know as rationality, reason, is not universal. So a famous historian then goes around saying that the job of the historian today, one of the things the historian has to do is provincialize Europe. What does it mean when you say provincialize Europe? That European ideas that came out of the Enlightenment rationality are not universal, they are provincial, just like any other ideas. They are not somehow superior. They do not explain other ideas. They are a self-contained world. That's a discursive field within which certain narratives grow up. Those narratives are not universal. Europe is as much provincial as China or India or the Arab world or Africa or anything else for that matter. Now, from here, I'd like to now come to the implications for the study of history. So we have spent more than 2 classes looking at this whole structuralism, post-structuralism. The idea that the past is constructed through this knowledge power grid. So anything that we say about the past is us, right? We are becoming the authors of a story. If reason is not universal, if the methods of reason, if rationality is not universal across time and space, that we cannot use modern ideas, rational ideas, to understand what was happening, to explain what was happening in 1000 AD or 1000 BC or whatever time, then the story of the past, that is history, is constructed through the gaze of the author. Now this is a crucial word here, the gaze. This word was introduced by one of the scholars we talked about last time, Michel Foucault, right? What does the gaze mean? What does gaze mean? You look at something, right? So you look at something. He says the power to look and the power to coherently put what you see into a narrative creates the gaze. So the historian has the gaze. You must have heard of that popular saying, right? Till lions have their own historians, the story of the hunt
will be the story of
the hunter. So till the lions have their story, their own historians, the story of the hunt will always be of the hunter going and the lion trying to attack and the hunter showing great bravery or great patience or great luck or whatever, the hand of God, and getting over the lion, or sometimes maybe not getting over the lion. Then the story is not written by the hunter but the hunter's friend. But that's it, the gaze. So who's the hunter here and who's the lion? Who writes these stories of the past? Who has within society, within a certain discursive field, who has the ability to look back? The historian. But historian is not just the person who sits in an archive or who stands on a podium and gives a lecture. The historian is also the state. The historian is also the journalist. The historian is also those who are keeping those records. Who does that? Who looks back and says this? Who collects what is important today? So, I'm giving this lecture, it's being recorded, you're all taking your notes. Whose story comes out? Your notes or my lecture? It's not the same thing. even if it's within the same discursive field. Which is why I started in the beginning talking about Saussure, saying that it was very interesting because he started off this whole trend which now brings up this question of the gaze, who's the author, but Saussure didn't write his own book. The course on general linguistics, that book, is actually written by his students from their class notes. But it is published in his name. So it's a little ironical, particularly given the whole intellectual movement of 100 years that Saussure's book started off. But the fact is, the gaze, and this gaze, because it is creating knowledge, it is also an act of power. It is constantly forcing you to do something or the other. And we'll see how it happens. Because what Foucault argues is that modernity imagines itself as this meta-structure, as this culmination of human history, that all human history is finally, wherever you live, whatever your social conditions, you are predestined to end up in modernity. You might be slow at it, you might be fast at it, you might be lucky at it, you might have a lot of obstacles, but eventually that's where you come up. And modernity, because it is based on knowledge, power, it works like a panopticon. Does anyone know what is a panopticon? So the panopticon was a reform in prisons. A reform in prisons in the 19th century. The idea of the panopticon was that you will have the largest number of prisoners in a prison with the least amount of restrictions, but behaving themselves with the least number of jailers or prison guards. That is the style of a panopticon. So you have all these cells in a circle around. It's like a circle, right? 3, 4 floors, you could be even higher. The circle. There's only one guard tower in the middle, and here the guard tower is transparent, but typically the guard tower, the prisoners can't see inside the guard tower. So they don't know. You can just have 2 guards, and every cell is open to the guard tower. So the prisoner doesn't know when he is being looked at, when the guard is noticing him. But the fact that you are always under the gaze, you can always be known, forces you to work according to what you have been told to work. It doesn't matter anymore. And the whole idea was, this becomes so much of a matter of practice, habit, routine, that prisoners soon start reforming themselves. The panopticon, with the least amount of repression, very little violence, very few guards, no beatings, other than exceptional cases. So you never know when are you going to get caught. You're not supposed to do this, so you're not supposed to do that. Maybe one day you escape, another day you are caught. You're always under the fear of the gaze. You always think the gaze is on you. And the gaze knows you, knows what you are doing. And the gaze expects you to do certain things. And if you do those things, then you're fine. When you don't do those things, you're punished. You're disciplined. And the idea of the panopticon as a prison was that this actually internalizes discipline within the prisoners. So soon enough, you don't even need anyone looking at you. You will behave like that. Following Foucault, and he himself argued that the hospital works a little like that. The school works like that. Modernity, the gaze of modernity looks back in time and organizes the past according to the demands of reason. It looks back. This is the gaze, right? You're looking back and saying, this is how it is organized. This is how the past is organized. And those who don't fit into the narrative of reason, everybody is judged according to that. Who's a good king? Who's a bad king? Which age was the golden age? Which age was the dark age? So, you might have historians who earlier said that 18th century India, with the collapse of the Mughal Empire, was a dark age because it prefaced the coming of colonialism and India's capture by the British. Then you have later historians who come and say that, well, actually it wasn't so bad, because even though politically there was fragmentation, the Mughal state collapsed, economically it was a very prosperous period. The economy was thriving, new things were happening. Massive trade, massive commerce. The commodification in agriculture, the spread of finances. But a Foucauldian historian, a post-structuralist historian, would go around and saying you're basically arguing within the same discursive field. You're just playing around. Should this dip be here, or should this be a higher thing? Is that a dip or is that a bump? That's all you're arguing about. It's the same discursive field. It is something which is imposed by the powerful, the people who are writing history. As simple as somebody who's alive. We have the power to define what those who are dead did or did not do. Those who are dead can't speak for themselves. So we can say, oh, this was right, this was wrong. Nehru was good, Nehru was bad. Gandhi was good, Gandhi was bad. Was Winston Churchill a nice guy, or was he a bad guy? We can decide. Churchill isn't there. Nor is Nehru or Gandhi. Right? But at another level, it is not just about the living. Of course, it is about the living. It's about those who are the author, who have the ability to be the author. So the whole argument in India has been, for example, that only a certain type of people have written history. So others should now get the right to write history. Interestingly, people on the Hindu right are using these ideas. The ideas of post-structuralism, however arcane and sleep-inducing, especially in an afternoon, they might be, the ideas of post-structuralism, in a sense, are now common sense among people. The idea that there is no anchor. Rationality does not explain everything. Rationality is just one way of looking at the past or the present society. Do we look at dowry through the eyes of reason, or do we look at dowry through the eyes of revelation? What makes one better than the other? And there can be reason with a small r applied to explain dowry. You don't need big R, which brings liberty and equality and fraternity with it, you can have a small r. What explains anything, right? Why would you say that Nehru was good or Gandhi was good? What basis? In fact, it is so interesting that recently you had somebody argue who, I mean, I can't bet on it, but almost actually I can perhaps bet on it, that facts are not facts. Facts are constructed. This is exactly what the implication on history is. Facts are constructed. Because facts are constructed, what is a fact? A factotum, a fact, a point of information is knowledge, which is produced through the knowledge power grid. It's constructed by somebody, right? The author who has his gaze. And this led to the whole idea of epistemic violence. So there are these things I want you to focus on. One is, the idea of the gaze. It's crucial to understand that the gaze is of the person producing knowledge. The gaze is of the person who's exercising power. And that in modern society, modernity itself thinks of itself like a panopticon, where the gaze of modernity is everywhere. Reason can look into anything at any time. It has a universal warrant to enter every home, every mind, every body, every structure, and pass judgment. And when reason enters and finds that your body or your mind is not correct, it disciplines you. It judges you as not modern enough, and then it disciplines you. And the argument is that this gaze, this claim of modernity, that we can use reason to go back and throw light on the past and produce this narrative of the past, which is the truth with a capital T, is what the post-structuralists argue does epistemic violence. What is epistemic violence? What does epistemic mean? Any idea? Epistemic violence. Look up, all of you have your cell phones on your table. Tell me, what does epistemic mean? It derives from epistemology. Epistemology. That is relating to knowledge.
Or its degree or degree of its validation.
Degree of its validation. Epistemic violence. That modernity and history being a discipline of modernity, and we'll come to the idea of discipline immediately after this. History, like sociology, like anthropology, all of these are what? Disciplines of modernity. They emerged in the modern times. Before that, you didn't have these disciplines. It does epistemic violence. Why? It imposes a narrative. It imposes a narrative which is an act of power. It's a violence. So it looks back at the past and says the past was backward. It looks back at a whole bunch. So basically what it would say is, what the argument would be is that there will be random things which happened. Random things which happened. What the gaze does is that it looks back in a certain manner and arranges them. It arranges them. This is epistemic violence. It arranges them in a narrative which is not inherent. There is no anchor to the structure. The anchor that is being given from outside by the historian, by the person with that gaze. He's gone back, and typically it was a he, of course it could be a she. So they go back and they create this narrative. They impose a structure. The structure could be of backwardness. The structure could be of barbarity. The structure could be of, the narrative could be of anything. Of growing liberty or falling liberty. That this society actually shows liberty doesn't exist. That these people never had the conceptions of equality. And because equality is one of the things that reason tells us is universal, societies which don't have a conception of equality are somehow less civilized. People who do not believe in liberty as a prerequisite, as a constitutive element of human beings, are somehow less human beings themselves. So you are doing epistemic violence. You are taking a stand, and through that knowledge power grid, you are creating this whole knowledge, which is doing epistemic violence to those who do not live within that discursive field. And your discursive field is going and saying, you are this, you are that, you are not progressed enough. Oh, you are really nice. You are Singapore, so you are Chinese mostly, but you are really civilized. And you are Korea, and you are Japan, and you are really cool. And you are Laos, and you are, you're not bad, but you are noble savages. And you are India, and like, backward. And we are constantly, because that epistemic violence has been done on us. When that epistemic violence happens, it prefigures physical violence. So the argument is that it's not physical violence which leads to the debasement of a culture. It is this narrative structure which is built through the gaze, through this knowledge power grid, which actually leads inevitably, in a sense, to physical violence, because then you see these people are not progressing. They are refusing modern medicine. There's a plague on, and they don't want to use the best ways of preventing the spread of plague. So we have to send the police and the army to force them into barracks for their own good, right? These people say that they are not going to get their daughters educated because they say women don't need to get educated. It's completely barbaric. They do not believe in the equality of human beings. So if need be, we are going to pull the child out of the parents, put the child in foster homes or in residential schools, and get the child the education that the child deserves. And the child or the parents are nobody to tell us anything. Because why? We have rationality. We are not doing it because we are barbarous. We have rationality. We have enlightenment. We have civilization on our side. That's why we are using violence. The post-structuralist historian says that this violence is not even seen as violence because there has been epistemic violence already done. The gaze has gone and created a certain knowledge within which the agents have to work according to that structure. They cannot. It doesn't matter what you think. So there can be an IS officer who doesn't care, अरे मेरे को तो पैसा बनाना है, क्या फर्क पड़ता है? There can be an IS officer who is completely committed to social reform. Irrespective. There might be a variation of degree, but that's what it is. Once that epistemic violence has happened, you're going to do social reform. So whether you bring democracy through holding gram sabhas or you bring democracy through dropping napalm bombs, the point is you are going to bring democracy. And you are going to force those people eventually to change their ways. It's a force. You're going to change them. Epistemic violence, this, right, creates the physical violence that we see modernity does. Of course, everyone wants electricity, right? How are we doing this? How is this PowerPoint up? How am I sort of lighted up for those cameras? How are your notebooks made and the cell phones that you use and your clothes all through electricity? And then you're telling me that we shouldn't build more dams and more thermal power plants? Of course, are you telling me that tribals don't need electricity? And if they don't want electricity, by God, they're going to get electricity. And I have a 5-year term and I'll see to it that they get electricity. Whether they like it or not, because it is for their own good. Their children are going to thank me. History is going to be kinder to me. Epistemic violence prefigures physical violence of colonialism, of modernity. It's not as if what the colonialists did in India, they hadn't already done in their home countries. So in England, the whole countryside was uprooted and thrown into cities. In France, in Germany, all over. In Russia, in Spain, in Italy, even countries which are less industrialized. They did exactly all those things that they did in the colonies. Now, the older Marxist historians, older as in intellectually older, right? One step before post-structuralism. They would argue that this was a function of capitalism. The post-structuralists, post-modernists, post-structuralists being the intellectual position, post-modernism being the political position of that, would argue that this is actually inherent into modernity. Inevitable. And once you have this epistemic violence that is taking place, people are being structured through this knowledge power grid, which is producing knowledge as it is exercising power, and it is exercising power, it is producing knowledge. It goes hand in. You can't see them as separate. The idea of discipline comes in, both as noun and as verb. So the discipline of history is also the verb, disciplines people. You are the colonized, you are the Indians, you are the English. The history of England, the history of India disciplines you. And not just in this manner, discipline then means that the school, the hospital, the mental asylum, the prison, they're all part of the same spectrum. The school is telling you to become a part of this meta-narrative, to become a disciplined citizen of this meta-structure. And it is not just your mind, your body, how your body is, what is a healthy body, what is a productive body, what does the body need to be. So the hospital, the school, you go outside what is the norm that has been laid down, right? The narrative structure that has been laid down within that discursive field, the norm. This is the norm. This is what you are supposed to do. Follow the norm. When you don't, then there are two routes for you: the prison or the mental asylum. What does the prison now do? What does the mental asylum now do, which it didn't do in pre-modern times? In pre-modern times, in pre-modern societies, mental asylums, prisons were the same thing. You just throw people out. Here the whole idea is to see to it that they get disciplined back into the norm, become normal again. So education is actually part of the same spectrum as the prison, as the hospital, as the mental asylum. Education creates, sort of socializes you into the norm, makes you normal, allows you to become a disciplined subject who can participate in the gaze, not just on the other but on yourself. So you look at yourself and say, why am I behaving like this? Why am I being so uncouth? Why am I not dressing well? Why is he so shabby, and why is he so lazy? And look at him, he's so organized. You're constantly doing this. Because if you look at that thing at the back, everybody is looking at everybody. Everybody is a CCTV camera. Everybody has the gaze on everybody. And whose gaze is it? It's not your gaze. It is the gaze of modernity, of reason, of the norm. You're constantly disciplining others, and others are disciplining you, and you are yourself disciplining yourself. Am I looking okay? Am I fine? And the moment you are not, you're constantly being disciplined. So social structures work in a way to discipline you. And those disciplines happen because why? We have a certain knowledge. That at a certain age, your hair should not be white. There should be hair, right? Your body shouldn't smell. You shouldn't do this. Your teeth should be like this. You should not be fat. You should be able to do this. I'm not saying that these are not things one should not do, but the moment you move out of the norm, there's a disciplining which happens, which is based on a academic discipline, the noun. And you're constantly being made to fit. So, before we finish, the task of the historian, according to the postmodernists, according to post-structuralist history, is to deconstruct the meta-narrative of history that we are given. We are told, this is it, this is history, this is India, this is Hindu, this is Muslim, this is colonialism, this is social reform, this is independence, this is progress, this is development. The task of the historian is to deconstruct it. Go and say, what is the discursive field? How was this narrative built? Whose gaze does this narrative embody? What is the knowledge power field, that discursive field? What knowledge power grid underlies that? Who is the author whose arbitrary meanings are being embedded into this? That is the job of the historian. So the historian needs to look back and say, what is Raja Ram Mohan Roy doing when he is banning sati with the help of William Bentinck? Of course, this is not a judgment on women being burnt alive on the pyre, but the thing is, why is that under the gaze? Why is not the fact that so many other people were being killed for so many other reasons under the gaze? What is happening there? Whose gaze is it? How is it get constructed? What does it lead to? What form of discipline? Both as noun and verb. That is the job of the historian. Deconstruct the construction of history within that discursive field. Tell people that this is the discursive field within which this discipline has been built up. This is the discursive field. This is how that narrative got structured. This is how it becomes coherent. These are the meanings within it. This is how it becomes coherent for all of us. And this is how meanings have been inscribed into it by these people. And there is nothing which can tell us, there is no criteria outside of that discursive field which can say that this discursive field is better than that. This narrative is superior to that. They are different narratives. Reason itself is not a criteria to differentiate two narrative fields, discursive fields. Because reason itself is rationality, is itself one discursive field. That is how it is structured. So the historian needs to do this. Deconstruct, take out the various layers which go into building a meta-narrative of history. This idea was then taken forward into understanding colonialism. And in the next class, we are going to look at one of the most famous and one of the most brilliant applications of this idea by a scholar named Edward Said and his book called Orientalism and the whole idea that came out of that. Right? So we'll end our class today here.